Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome on the podcast today Dr. Nyil Khwaja. Nyil is the warden at Broome Bird Observatory. And if, like me, you know nothing about Broome Bird Observatory, then hang around because I'm particularly interested, and I'm sure you are too, in finding out what goes on in the northwest of Australia and how these wonderful birds come to land and be part of the ecosystem, which is the desert meeting the sea at the Indian Ocean. And you've got this wild bunch of species that all connect there in the tropics. So, Nyil, welcome, and it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks very much, Ian. It's great to be here.
Now, Nyil, you are the warden there at the Broome Bird Observatory, and in Broome right now, you've just finished your working day. So just give us a little bit of an idea of what happens. You wake up and what does a typical day of a warden of a bird observatory look like?
Well, today, I can talk you through today, which was one of the sort of highlight sort of days that I get to have as warden. So we have quite a varied set of responsibilities out here, including keeping the place running and maintained and everything like that. But we also have to raise enough revenue to keep the place going. We're totally self-funded. And one of the key ways we do that is by running guided tours. Okay. And the wardens do that along with our two assistant wardens who we have through the season. So I was leading a tour group today out onto the lakes of Roebuck Plains. So I did get up early this morning. The tour didn't leave crazy early. It left at 7, but I got up around 5:30 to prepare the eskies for morning tea and all the cold water and the telescopes and the chairs and everything, get them all ready to go in the vehicles. And we set off at 7 o'clock. We only run this full day tour once a week. Otherwise, we run shorter tours of 2 to 3 hours, but this one goes from 7 until 3 in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. And it's called the Lakes Tour because we go out across a big cattle station to 3 large freshwater lakes. Well, they're large at the start of the year and they're sort of steadily shrinking through the year, but they're still sort of the most significant wetlands around in the landscape, even at this time of year, October, which is starting to get quite dry in Broome. So they become really important for birds during that time. And we had 7 people out on our tour today, so it was me plus another staff member taking them out. We basically spent the day going bird watching. It was fantastic. It was really hot. But we saw some brilliant species out there. We saw lots of brolgas, which are sort of famous birds of the landscape up here. Lots of Australian pratincoles, which often live in the same place as brolgas, but also heaps of migratory shorebirds that had come back. And I saw a Gouldian finch in Broome for the first time for me, which was quite exciting. Wow. All in all, it was an excellent day. And I've just returned now to chat to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for making yourself available. And at the Broome Bird Observatory, that's like right near the ocean.
That's right.
So all those shorebirds that migrate to the northwest of Australia are right there on your front doorstep. But where you went today is your backyard. Yeah,
that's a good way of putting it. We often talk about the bay being out the front and the plains being out the back. It's one of the things that makes Broome really special. Probably the sort of top thing that makes it so fantastic for birds is Roebuck Bay, which we're on the shores of, which is just incredible because it's got such a wide tidal range. It's really shallow. It's got lots of creeks and it's just got such rich mud.
So Nyil is just moving locations. You would have noticed in that last little segment that we had a little bit of a dropout issue. So let's go again. I was just asking Nyil about, as an academic, what's his particular area of research or interest?
Since I've moved to the Bird Observatory, my research is really focused on the observatory's programs, which are focused on migratory shorebirds. Really fascinating group of birds that move. Most of them, or many of them, between breeding grounds in the high Arctic or other areas of the north of the world. That's where they breed, and then they migrate down to areas that basically are their feeding sites for the rest of the year. And that's places like Roebuck Bay here, but there are important sites all around the world that host these migratory shorebirds when they're not breeding.
Okay. Well, let's talk more about these migratory birds that come from Arctic and other places. What makes Broome so special? Is it just because we're at the northern end and they don't have to keep flapping as far? Like, what is it about Broome that makes it attraction?
I think that certainly doesn't hurt, the fact that it's closer than other places. But there's more to it than that as well. So the number one reason why Broome is so important for these birds is Roebuck Bay, which is the sort of large embayment that we're on the shores of here at the Bird Observatory. So here at the BBO, the sun doesn't set in the west because we're on an embayment on the west coast. But the bay is really shallow. It's got this huge tidal range, and it's got this beautiful sort of really fine muddy sediment, which is basically just full of life. It's full of crabs and worms and bivalves and other things like that. And that's prime shorebird food. So basically it's thought to be the most diverse and probably the most abundant mudflat in terms of the amount of animals that live in it anywhere in the world. So that's what's really special about Broome, is that we've got this bay that's just perfect shorebird feeding grounds. But what also helps is having shallow freshwater wetlands just on our doorstep as well, which some other shorebird species specialize in using, although most of them do occur more on the coast.
Yeah. Well, how special that we've got this in Australia. And it's great the work that you're doing there as an education centre and as a voice for conservation. You've got these tidal mudflats that go out for ages. And so the birds kind of congregate, where the water meets the mud. And so as the tide comes in, people can see the birds up close, can't they?
Yeah, that's exactly right. No, that's a very good summary of how it works. So although shorebirds do feed all over the mudflat, and some of them will feed far away from the tide's edge, particularly the ones that are chasing things like crabs. For most of the species, the best sort of softest, freshest mud is right on the edge of the tide line. So it does really affect what you can see, the time of tide that you come at. If you come on a really, really low tide, it actually can sometimes look like there's no birds in the bay at all, because they're all right on the tide's edge. And even there can be, it's a large bay. There can be over 100,000 shorebirds here. Gosh. And we have people go down to our viewing area and say they couldn't see a thing, they couldn't see a single bird, and that can happen. So it is important to sort of be aware of the tides. Everyone in Broome is very aware of the tides because our tides are so huge here. And whatever you're interested in fishing or birds or swimming or whatever, it's quite dependent on the tides. But yeah, so what happens as the tide comes in is the birds sort of get pushed closer and closer to where we are on land. Eventually, what tends to happen on most tides is that about 2 hours before high tide, actually all of the mud that they could feed on is covered up. And what they have to do is then just come onto the beaches and sort of wait out the tide, basically. They just sit there for 4 hours until the tide goes back out again. That's the time they try and get a bit of sleep and a bit of rest. And that's the time you can also get closest to them on the beaches. But we also have to be sort of careful not to disturb them as well. That's a bit of a balancing act. Yeah,
I think we're learning more and more, and that's why research is so important. What's the impact of the interaction between us human beings and the wildlife around us? So let's take a single species, choose one that migrates, and take us through from sort of hatching out of the egg to coming to Broome and going back. What does it look like? And choose a bird and tell us about it.
Sure, I'll talk about red knots, perhaps a small, sort of slightly pigeon-shaped bird that go a brick red color when they're breeding. They're quite plain the rest of the time. They feed mostly on bivalves, and they gather in really sort of large groups together on tidal mudflats like Roebuck Bay. So we've got a good population of them here. They're the birds that travel the furthest from here. So they're actually born, a baby red knot hatches out on the New Siberian Islands, which are off the north coast of Siberia, north of the Arctic Circle, a long way from here, about 11,000 kilometers from here.
Wow.
And they're probably hatching out in July or August, probably more likely kind of late July or through August. And they're up there. So people often ask why these birds making these perilous, very long and sort of costly journeys when there's so much food here in Roebuck Bay. It seems like quite an obvious question. But basically they're up there to take advantage of a big boom in insect life, and the chicks will feed on the insects, and that's how they grow quickly. Because although shorebird chicks they're kind of like baby chickens or baby emus, they can run around very quickly after hatching, and they actually feed themselves. They don't get fed by their parents like baby songbirds do, like magpies or something like this. So they are there to take advantage of how many insects there are in the Arctic during summer. So that chick will hatch out, and then after maybe as little as 5 weeks, they'll have grown to full size, grown a full set of feathers, and they'll set off on their first migration south. It's thought that they do that with adult sort of guidance, with their generally with the adult males, actually with their fathers. The mothers are thought to leave a bit earlier. And they then fly down to a very important area for shorebirds called the Yellow Sea. They basically use all their energy to fly there, and then they need to replenish the energy reserves again to make the next flight down to Australia. So the Yellow Sea is a large area of mudflats in northeast China and around the Korean peninsula as well. So that's that step. And then the really amazing thing from there is that the adult males that they traveled there with, they're experienced birds that have been back and forth a few times. They then leave the young birds behind, and they fly to Broome. And then we start to see juvenile birds, so birds that are in their first year of life, just 2 or 3 months old, arriving in Broome well behind the adults. So that's quite amazing. These birds are arriving in Roebuck Bay for the first time with no one to show them the way. And you know how that information is sort of encoded for them is just something that we simply don't know. It's just
one of the great mysteries of the natural world, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But it's always such an exciting time. It happens at this time of year, a little bit earlier actually in the year, usually through September, that we start to see these first juveniles each year. You can identify them based on their feathers. So
we're in October recording this. So who's there now? Mum and dad and the juvenile, they've all come?
Yeah, almost all the birds are back. There are still quite a lot of juveniles still to arrive. But certainly we expect that pretty much all adult birds are back in the bay now. And for a lot of species, most of the juveniles will be back already. For some others, we're still seeing actually just the first ones arriving. It was only 2 days ago we had the first juvenile bar-tailed godwit, which is one of our more common species. So there are still some arriving, but by the time it gets to the end of this month, certainly by the time it gets to the end of November, the end of October, we would say there's a lot of almost all the birds are back, and by the end of November we expect kind of they are all back.
Okay,
we can count them.
And then this red knot, it is there in large numbers at Roebuck Bay there by Broome, and it will stay there for how long, and what will it do during the time that it's there?
So once it's here, the key things that they've got to do are replace their feathers in what's called a molt. And they will do that gradually. They shed sort of a few feathers at a time and replace them gradually. And that's quite an energetically expensive sort of process. That they're not preparing for migration or recovering from it, but they're still having to do this. They replace their feathers, which costs them a bit of energy. Otherwise, they're just sort of feeding enough to just keep going, really, and try and have an easier life as possible. So the young birds are actually staying here for well over a year once they've arrived. That's actually quite important if you're a bird watcher interested in visiting Broome, because what it means is that even though these birds are migratory, the young birds aren't going north in their first year. And so you can see them all year round. You'll see there'll still be maybe 1,000 or so red knots in the bay in June and July. They'll just be the previous year's young birds that haven't migrated north. They're just waiting to do it in subsequent years.
Because they haven't got the physical capacity to make the journey?
That is a very good question why they don't do it. And I don't think it's something that is widely agreed on why it happens. There's a few interesting things about it. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, there's a lot of shorebirds that are adapted to freshwater, as well as the ones that are adapted to the coastlines. There's also some that are adapted to grassland. So shorebirds have different habitats. And the freshwater and grassland shorebirds all seem to go north in their first year. It's only these coastal ones that delay it. And they do seem to be physically mature. But the theory that I've heard that maybe makes the most sense is similar to what I was saying before, that it takes them some time to learn how to feed efficiently enough in the sort of complex environment of a tidal mudflat, how to feed efficiently enough to put on enough weight quickly that they can make a migration to go north.
I like that. I like that theory.
Kind of a speculative explanation, but that's kind of the one that makes most sense that I've heard.
We can write a thesis to support that theory because I like that theory.
Good.
So they leave here or leave where you are around about May. Is that correct?
That's spot on for red knots. So actually, most shorebirds are going in. Some of them go in March. Vast majority go in April. Red knots are about the last ones to leave us, and they leave kind of late April through till early May. Yeah.
And
so
how many?
Sorry, go on.
How many trips will they make back and forth to Broome, Siberia to Broome and back?
They generally keep going. So sort of skipping over to another species, the bar-tailed godwit, which is a bit larger and maybe would be a bit longer lived. I'm not sure, but we've got records in the bay of a bird that I think was 30 years old. It might have been 29, somewhere in that vicinity. And that was a bird that just kept migrating every year. I have heard of a couple of famous birds, I think over on the East Coast somewhere that have like retired and have stopped migrating in their mid to late 20s. But I think most of the ones here apparently just keep going. Yeah.
Not even the grey nomads from Perth will have been to Broome that often.
That's right. No, it's a lot of trips.
That's an extraordinary number of trips. And they change colour. At what point do they change colour? I know they sort of get this breeding plumage. Is that just before they're due to go?
That's for most species. That's right. Yeah, and actually, Broome is a really good place in Australia to see the birds getting into breeding plumage before they go. I have heard people thinking that mistakenly that you just can't see any birds in breeding plumage in Australia, and that's not true for most species. If you come up to Broome in February, March, and April, you see most of them in stunning breeding plumage. There are a few exceptions, so some of them do only change as they go north or after they've left. Grey plovers are a good example of that. But for almost all of them, they get into these really bright, fresh colours before they go, and it's a fantastic time to see them.
Do you know what the connection is between the change of colour and is it related to breeding, or is it related to the flight?
I think it's related to breeding. So
to make them more attractive?
I think there's a bit of both. So I think probably some of the colours that they have on their sort of underparts might be more just, the bright red colours some of them go. They actually might play a role in attracting a mate. But if you think about where they're going up to sit on a nest. A nest is usually a really simple sort of just a scrape in the ground type of thing that's just directly on some tundra or some kind of open area. And they need to be well camouflaged. They also want to be camouflaged while they're here, but they're in a different environment where they probably want to look a bit more like rocks or stones. So it kind of makes sense for them to be more grey here from the back.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of being in the tundra, it's these more sort of speckledy, broken up kind of colours, black and gold type or reddish, that actually helps them to blend in that environment. So I think there's a bit of both, kind of camouflage and also probably also attracting mates, as you say.
Yeah. I just find it all incredible how it all
It is.
happens. Um,
Yeah.
so, what kind of numbers of species might there be found in Broome, and how representative is that of all the birds in Australia?
So the quote that we often sort of like to promote is that we've recorded about a third of all of Australia's tally of bird species.
Gosh.
What that means is of all the species ever recorded in Australia, we have recorded in all time a third. So we've recorded in Broome, on the Broome list, I believe there's currently 334 species that have ever been recorded in Broome, which is quite a lot.
That is.
But that wouldn't, about 80 or so of those are rare vagrants that would turn up once or twice or a few times.
Yeah.
And you're looking at about 240, 250 that would be regular species that you occur in kind of every year that really are kind of calling the Broome area home. But that's still pretty good.
Which leads me to the next question. The health of the species that are visiting, are the numbers growing? Are they dwindling? Which kind of birds are under threat? And what role does Australia play in nurturing the growth of these species?
Yeah, it's a great question. Probably some of the most threatened birds in Australia and in the Broome region are the shorebirds, the ones that we sort of are so passionate about and so fascinated by. And their populations have declined quite significantly over the last sort of 20, 30 year period. And probably the reason for those declines is to do with their migrations. It's the fact that they depend on habitats in many different parts of the world. And so that's kind of a chain that's only as strong as a weakest link, if you use that metaphor. So, and what's really caused issues for these birds has been habitat loss, probably first and foremost in the Yellow Sea area, in that halfway stopover staging ground is what we call it, where they feed up on their way north and they feed up on their way south. Lots of mudflats there, which are really important for the birds, have been lost over the last 50 years or longer. So it's something I sort of try and be a bit careful when I talk to people about, because you don't really want people in Australia to sort of throw their hands up and say, oh, it's someone else's problem. Yeah. There are certainly still threats here in Australia, and there's really important habitat that's under threat here as well. There's I know there's a proposed development in Moreton Bay in Queensland, which is a really important habitat for the eastern curlew, one of the most endangered species of shorebird in Australia. So we've got to make sure that the habitats here stay well protected. There is sort of promising trends out of China, particularly in recent years. The Yellow Sea is being designated as a World Heritage Area, and I think nature reserve designations and generally protection of nature is starting to be taken more seriously. We've got to make sure that the habitat here stays well protected, and that we're not putting extra pressure on these birds in the form of disturbance or other threats.
Yeah, and presumably when people come into your centre as an education centre, this is something that you talk about. How about kids and high schoolers who come in? I don't know, if I was in high school and I was going to a bird observatory years ago, what would grab my attention? How would you grab my attention if teenage Ian walked into your centre?
Yeah, it's something my partner's quite good at. So we share the job. We work together as a couple, as wardens, and she's a registered teacher. But something that we have in here, which has really captured kind of everyone's enthusiasm, is this flapping challenge. So we've got a sort of it's basically a tablet taped up onto the wall with a little program installed that has a camera. Yep. And it says, how far can you fly? You've got 60 seconds, and basically you have to just flap your wings and it will give you a score.
Good.
It gives you a high score for the day. And we hope by doing that, as well as everyone having a bit of fun and a bit of competition, like it sort of puts into context, like the other amazing thing about shorebird migration, which is that they have to flap the whole time. They don't glide or soar. So that's a sort of a subtle way of sort of putting into context how amazing these feats of migration are. do find they enjoy going out as well, and being shown the birds. Often making a bit of a game out of it can help, sort of bingo type thing, or just trying to spot different species. Working you into an activity like migration, or getting kids in the mud as well. This is often maybe more for younger children than teenagers, but we do a mangrove tour, and also we'll take larger groups out onto the mud, where we get really sort of stuck in. We might pull a few shells and look at some mud skippers or crabs out there as well. And yeah, getting muddy kind of often goes down quite well with younger guests.
I've got an education background, and I reckon if you just for a whole term did nothing else but study birds, you could basically teach the entire syllabus through bird watching. You could obviously teach about science, you could teach about photography and art, you could do music. I mean, there's so many subjects that come into play. You could do engineering, and the way the wings
Absolutely.
are. Yeah. You could do geography, where these birds come from and what they do on the way and where they stop, and how you could do maths, how far they travel, how many days it takes them, how many kilometers per day are they traveling. So there's so many things, I think, that are related to birds that kids can learn about. Yeah, it's been fascinating to hear more about the Broome Bird Observatory, or BBO as it's referred to by you and others locally, I'm sure. And I look forward to being out there myself in June, but I know what's going to happen. I'm going to be there and they say, well, if you come back in September, you might see. And if you come back in January, you might see. So I'll have to become a migratory tourist from Sydney.
Sounds good. We'll very much look forward to having you up here, Ian. It'll be great to show you some of the things that we've been talking about. Okay.
Thanks heaps for your time, and thanks so much for what you're doing to protect this very special part of Australia. And hats off to you and your team. Good on you, mate.
Thanks, Ian.